I think we'll go ahead and get started. I suspect some other people will trickle in, but I want to go ahead and kick off our event and let our speakers get going. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Matthew Wilson. I am a director of the Center for Faith and Learning and a professor in the Political Science Department here at SMU. It is the Center for Faith and Learning here on campus that is the sponsor of tonight's event. And just to tell you a little bit about the center, we were created here at SMU 3 years ago with the purpose of bringing more integration between intellectual and spiritual life on campus. Our mission is to promote dialogue between the life of the mind and the life of the spirit, and to explore the ways in which those might inform each other. We are deeply convinced, and our center is founded on the premise that religion and religious perspectives have really important and interesting things to say about a variety of important questions across a range of disciplines in the academy, and also that the life of the mind and that intellectual learning and scholarship can really enrich the lived faith within faith traditions. So based on our conviction that both of those things are true, one of the ways in which we facilitate this dialogue between intellectual and spiritual life on campus is to sponsor lectures, conferences, symposia, just like this one. And so we're really happy this evening to be able to sponsor this event and to be able to encourage this dialogue and this discussion. So we're delighted to have been able to bring this evening Ryan Danker, who will be our featured speaker tonight. Ryan Danker is Associate Professor of Church History and Methodist Studies at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C. Ryan specializes particularly in the history of the Wesleyan Methodist movement under John and Charles Wesley. So we're going to be taking a step back from the present day tonight and looking at the origins of Methodism and some of the political activities and social activism in the early Methodist movement, but of course that will have resonance for and implications for today. Ryan is very active not only in scholarship and early Methodism, but also has been an active participant in Methodist Catholic dialogue and is an active member of the Charles Wesley Society, the Wesleyan Theological Society, the American Academy of Religion. So he brings a wealth of both historical, religious, theological expertise to this topic. After Ryan has presented this evening, then we're going to have a response from Professor Ted Campbell, who is of our very own Perkins School of Theology. He's Professor of Church History at Perkins, and his research interests overlap quite considerably with Professor Danker's, which works out well, makes him a good respondent for this. But he has written extensively books and articles on Methodist history, pietism in the 17th and 18th centuries, Christian ecumenism, so he'll bring a wealth of relevant research background to this. So the way that this is going to work is that Professor Danker will make his presentation, then Professor Campbell will offer some thoughts and responses, and then we'll kick off a discussion session. So we'll have some opportunity for people in the audience to make comments and ask questions as well. So we very much look forward to this, but let me step aside and let our speakers begin. And go ahead, Professor Danker.
Thank you. You're right there. While I get this on, I'm going to do some self-promotion. There's the new book. And it's on the topic, so that actually works, right? Yes, there it is. It does exist. Yes. And there is an SMU faculty member in that book, too. Billy is in that book. Yep. Okay. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to try to stick to my text. Otherwise, I'm like every other academic. If I don't stick to that, we'll be here all night. So what I'm going to try to do in academic terms tonight is to address the topic of a Wesleyan political theology, or a theologically informed political tradition, to put it that way. In basic terms, however, here's the question. How would John Wesley vote? Now, before everyone gets too excited, I'm not going to lay out the reasons why John Wesley would vote for any particular candidate now running for that White House that's just right down the street from my place. Nor am I going to attempt to assign John Wesley to any particular American political party. So, everybody relax. But at the same time, I do believe that there is a Wesleyan political vision that can be useful to contemporary American Wesleyans and hopefully informative for people who are outside that tradition. And I think even in our own context, even in the midst of a rancorous political climate. In fact, I believe that his response within his own context is actually informative for what I think would be a good response within our context. It shouldn't surprise you that someone from Washington has flown down to Dallas and can't help but talk about politics, of course. And I was not surprised when Dr. Rankin asked me to fly down and talk about the topic, politics. Within the Beltway or the swamp, depending on your perspective, we live and breathe this stuff. I remember this was the last presidential primary season. I had just started on the faculty at Wesley, and I was invited to a dinner at a faculty member's home, and there were about 10 of us from the faculty at this dinner. And as things were being finalized, we were all sitting in the living room, and the host simply looked at us and said, "All right, let's go around the room. Everybody announce who you're supporting currently in the campaign." I just moved from North Carolina. You would never talk about that at a dinner party, only in Washington. But that still begs the question, who would John Wesley vote for? Now, I'm going to address this under a number of different headings. These are the three I'm going to look at: Wesley's context, his identifiable political themes, or at least some of them. We're not going to, it would take a long time to go through all of them. And then what I'm calling an embodied Wesleyan politic. It has to be admitted right from the beginning then that when we're looking at John Wesley or any figure in 18th century Britain, we're talking about monarchists. I actually sat through a presentation at AAR on Wesley's politics once, and no one dared to mention that topic, but that has to be said from the beginning. He was a monarchist. Wesley actually argued that limited monarchy was the best form of government to ensure liberty. The worst form, democracy. Think about that. Very rarely do you find someone in Britain at this time who wasn't a monarchist. The debates, they had debates on related topics to the monarchy, but the debates hinged on who the rightful king was, not whether or not you should have a king. The Wesley family was in fact divided. Here, everybody loves Susanna, so there you go. The Wesley family was divided on the topic of who the rightful king was. And for those of you who know your Wesleyan history, you'll remember that Susanna refused to say amen after prayers for King William. And of course, she was a Jacobite. So she was one who believed that the rightful dynastic line went through James II and his son, and not through William and Mary. So Samuel Wesley, her husband's response was, "If we are to have two kings, we shall have two beds." And he moved out, literally. So arguably, you could make this argument, John Wesley was the happy result of the end of their political hostilities, because he arrived just over a year after the end of that debate between the two of them. Yes. So, but at the same time, Susanna never changed her mind. Samuel Wesley Jr., so the oldest of the Wesley boys, was probably a Jacobite, or at least he was connected to the Jacobites in London. It's hard not to think he wasn't a Jacobite. He was connected to a man named Bishop Atterbury, who is the famed Westminster traitor who was actually put up on trial and expelled from Britain and sent over to France to be with his beloved Stuarts. The Georgia Colony, where John and Charles Wesley both spent some time in the 1730s, although it was named after a Hanoverian, was a hotbed of Jacobitism. Now, we don't have time to go into all the details at this point in terms of how connected the Methodists were to Jacobitism, but there are some really interesting connections there. I will give you one. The Earl and Countess of Huntington and many members of George Whitfield's Tabernacle congregation were Jacobites. In fact, it's argued that the Earl of Huntington, of course, we're talking about Selina Huntington's husband. She's more famous in Methodist circles than he is. It's arguable that he died of a broken heart after so many of his friends were executed after the end of the Second Jacobite Rebellion in 1745. This is all noteworthy because, and here you go, Culloden, excuse me. The first half of the 18th century, and remember John Wesley's born in 1703, was marked by the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745. My point, though, is both the extreme monarchical context in which Wesley lived and breathed, but also the tumultuous political context, in tone, if not in action, similar to our own. Obviously, we are not on the battlefield, literally. Wesley's own monarchical views would have seemed moderate at the time, and he accepted the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to maintain a Protestant England and a Protestant monarchy. For Wesley, the maintenance of Protestantism overruled his attachment to any dynastic line. His anti-Catholicism, at least politically, is noteworthy, whether or not modern nice Methodists like to admit it. We cannot say, however, that Wesley's political ideals can simply be transported in time without some kind of adjustment. However, I do see some similarities to his time and ours that are distinctly striking. And I think useful to note as we explore the question of how Wesley might inform our own political discourse. I'm thinking of one in particular, even within the context that I've described, one of competing, right, the context is competing monarchical claims, but here's something I think is similar to our own time. The 18th century in Britain saw the distinct rise of political partisanship. It's interesting that George Washington told the Americans, when we were starting out our own experiment, to look out for partisanship. He was speaking from experience based on his own context. In Britain, with the consistent funding of government, which is another topic all of its own, Parliament remained in session, and the workings of government, for the first time, never closed shop. Remember, before this, the king and the parliament would have to work out the funding of government at different intervals, and so there were times when they weren't always in session. You establish the Bank of England and they start giving loans to the government to stay open continuously, and then all of a sudden you have continuous political discourse. One of the repercussions of consistent government was the distinct partisanship. In other words, the formation of a political class who actually had a political vocation. But it's actually funny, at least I think so, the lengths to which this partisanship in this period would actually go. There were two distinct parties at this time, groupings, parties that kind of emerged. It's the Whigs and the Tories. The Wesleys as a family were Tories, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the Whigs and the Tories not only represented different financial interests. The Tories were the landed gentry. They were the ones who thought finance should be in the land. The Whigs were primarily, at this point, those who were had resources in the financial markets. So that's a different understanding of wealth that was kind of behind their political arguing. But what do? They start carving out London like rival gangs. It's fascinating. The Whigs had their coffee shops and pubs. The Tories had theirs. They wouldn't eat with one another. They had competing news outlets. Does that sound familiar? And of course, they were debated and read their competing news outlets in their separate pubs and coffee shops. It went so far that it extended to hospitals. The Tories had St. Bart's, which I've got a picture of here, and the Whigs had St. Thomas's. They didn't even want to be sick together. Now, when I first heard this, I was reminded of what President Reagan said just after they took him in for surgery after he was shot in 1981. He looked up at the medical personnel and said, "I hope you're all Republican." Now, the thing is, Reagan was joking. In the 18th century, they weren't. The political context of the 18th century was, in fact, I think, much more volatile than our own. The Jacobite debate, along with two violent armed rebellions, made the state and the church itself unstable until the end of the Second Rebellion was quashed in 1745. Likewise, partisan wrangling extended into the church and would ultimately create a political divide between Anglican establishment and dissenting nonconformity that would cause fears of rebellion that would extend all the way to the end of the century. What we can take from this cursory view of the context is the need for caution, yes. But we can also see similarities, and in this case I think the major similarity is partisanship and sectarianism that informs our exploration and I think will help us to formulate a distinctly Wesleyan political vision based on the way that Wesley responded to his own context. All right, so Wesley's identifiable political themes. So, given my hesitancy to export 18th century politics without adjustment, I will spend just a bit on Wesley's politics as I move instead toward three political themes that I think are applicable from Wesley's thought. I've mentioned that the Wesleys were Tories, which, for lack of a better term, means that they were part of the more conservative political expression of the time. Reg Ward said that Wesleys were country Tories. He said they were xenophobic. I think Bill Gibson of Oxford Brookes has argued for a more nuanced approach. He says they were high church and Tory, and that was paramount, but not the only concern that the Wesleys had when it came to voting practices. So, if Wesley was a Tory, an establishment man who believed in a close alliance between the crown and the church, and thus a Protestant establishment grounded in tradition, what can we take from him for today? Let me say from the beginning that the most foundational attribute of Wesley's political vision is that it is first and foremost not political, it's theological. For the most part, Wesley's theology informs and shapes his politics, not the other way around. Now, his arguments were often based on scripture and church tradition, even if from time to time he appears to have a pro-England or a pro-Hanoverian argument. It does happen, but primarily the focus is theology, not politics. But the three themes that I want to highlight from his thought are these. One, you have a concern for the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable. Second, a concern for religious liberty, even within the established church, and he uses that for that reason. And three, you have a concern for human welfare, acknowledging the Imago Dei. Now, there are ways to categorize Wesley within a political school of thought. And SMU's own Billy Abraham has done so, I think, persuasively by saying that Wesley was a Burkean, one for whom custom, tradition, and the tried and true were foundational to his political vision. I think Abraham is right, especially as it relates to how Wesley's tradition-informed theology was the primary inspiration for his politics. Others have seen his Whig ideals in Wesley, especially as it relates to his arguments against the American Revolution. James Thobaben of Asbury has noted this ideological anomaly within Wesley's overall conservative outlook. I would argue that this is true even if Wesley's understanding of liberty and rights came not from the Enlightenment, but rather from a theological understanding of the image of God in humanity. But first, let me start with the poor. I need to start with the poor because Wesley loved the poor. That's something you can see in all of his writings. He actually preferred the company of the poor. He wrote this, he said this. And this is not because Methodism was primarily composed of the poor. That is a myth about early Methodism that's often spread around. It's interesting, Methodism had more of the, they had different class strata. So technically Methodism had more of the, what we would call upper class and per capita, and more of the lower working classes per capita. The group that it didn't have them a lot of was this middle sort. But it was not a group completely dominated by the poor. In Wesley's letters, you can see that he preferred the poor. Why? Because of their detachment to the things of the world. Because of their faith and because of their simplicity. He wrote this in 1757. He said, "I love the poor. In many of them I find pure, genuine grace, unmixed with paint." I like that, unmixed with paint, folly and affectation. He did enter the political foray in defense of the poor many times. His attack on the gin industry, for example, had much less to do with alcohol, which he did not oppose. Don't tell the holiness movement that. But more to do with its abuse and the cost of basic necessities. Gin was the drug of the day. All right, I think you can compare it to the opioid crisis that we're facing in our own country. I think that would be a much better comparison than if you're wondering about the kind of gin you would have at the bar. Hogarth, the famous satirist of 18th century England, drew a scene called Gin Lane. And here, I know you can't see all the details here, but you can see some of them. There's death, there's neglect, there's degeneracy, all the aftermath of gin. If you look closely enough at that, you see people have hung themselves. If you don't have a strong constitution, don't look too closely at Hogarth's prints. All right. But at another level, the distillation of liquor uses grains that could be used for bread. This is part of Wesley's argument. And when those grains are used for something else, making grain less available, costs go up. And so when you have something as basic as bread that people can't afford, all of a sudden you have Wesley's ire because it hurts the poor. So Wesley's objection to the gin industry begins with the question, what does this do to the poor? And that's a vital place, I think, to begin any Wesleyan approach to politics. Wesley also attacked a designation that was popular at the time called the deserving poor. The term was common in Britain to describe those who were trying their best but just simply couldn't make it. According to those who used the term, these and only these people were worthy of our attention and concern. But Wesley rejected this categorization entirely. All persons are worthy of our concern. The scripture makes no such designation. It simply says you are to help the poor and the needy. Wesley refused to make the designation based on these scriptural grounds. He did this by pointing to the systemic issues that led to poverty, thus a similar approach to his rejection of gin, many of which are out of an individual person's control. The designation deserving poor implies that every person has the opportunity and the means to raise themselves up from poverty. Wesley wrote in his journal, he wrote this, "So wickedly, devilishly false is that common objection, they are poor only because they are idle." The second one I want to look at is I'm calling religious liberty. I think Wesley had a distinct concern for religious liberty. There is a caveat, however. When he speaks of religious liberty, he's referring primarily to members of the Church of England who at that point constituted 90% of the population in the British Isles, or at least in Britain. But it also, when he's speaking of religious liberty, he might include Trinitarian Protestants, right? Unitarians are heretics. Catholics are dangerous subverters with foreign allegiance. No offense to the Catholics in the room. But his concern for religious liberty comes out when he's defending the Methodists from mobs, magistrates, and established clergy, or all three at the same time. We have to remember that early Methodism was suspect. It arose in the shadow of great social and political upheaval, not just some of the things I've described, but stemming from the previous century, from the 17th century, a century of extreme bloodshed, the fall of the monarchy, the church, the turmoil of the Commonwealth under Cromwell, the restoration of the monarchy and the restoration of the church, the expulsion of the Puritans, which would have included both of Wesley's grandfathers, and the expulsion of a Catholic monarch, James II, all of which led to the many issues that I've already tried to raise earlier. We should never underestimate the way in which the 17th century informed the 18th century, especially as I think the ghost of the beheaded Charles I haunted England for well over a century. And so when John Wesley starts sounding at least ideological, not theologically like the regicides of the last century and uses some of their patterns in the creation of a subculture of exclusive societies where you need a ticket to get in the door. Who knows what they're doing behind those closed doors? And it's not hard to see why some would react negatively. So often we think of Methodism as this benign force. It might be now, but it wasn't then, okay? Wesley did have a radical edge. I mean, we're not talking about Billy Graham in knee breeches and a three-cornered hat here. So on more than one occasion, Wesley actually took legal action to protect the Methodists' religious liberty. He took these arguments all the way to what was called the King's Bench, which is a precursor of their now modern Supreme Court. His arguments were not entirely based on law, however, but on the basic right of peaceful Christians to gather for edification. He was arguing within an established Christian church, right? The Church of England's established. But he was primarily arguing for the right to spread the gospel without hindrance. This may all sound rudimentary to us in the U.S., where we're used to the right to practice religion. But keep in mind that technically the Methodist Society meetings were easily categorized as conventicles. That would have been an illegal and illicit meeting. And by the way, when you think of early Methodism, remember the average Methodist at the time was a woman. If she had in fact been caught and charged under the Conventicle Act for attending one of these meetings, she would have bankrupted her family. So, I mean, there's all kinds of layers to this that I think are very interesting. But what is a conventicle? It's a detached group meeting away from the clergy of the Church of England. It was illegal. The Methodists could have met as dissenters, that was the term, or non-Church of England Trinitarian Protestants under the 1689 Act of Toleration. But Wesley refused to see the movement as anything outside of the Church of England, that it was meant to revive. In fact, he famously argued that if the Methodists left the Church of England, God would leave the Methodists. Yet because of this, he opened the Methodists up to a state of legal limbo, and even then his basic argument for maintaining his system of classes and societies was based on the basic good of Christian formation. So while his opponents saw actions that had been used in the previous century by the Puritans, right before they undermined society, the king, etc., led to the English Civil Wars, you can put the picture together, Wesley refused to see his actions in this light, and instead his argument was based on the progress of the gospel, and he believed that with that intention, he and his Methodists should be left alone. I think it's easy to see the arguments on both sides of the equation. But what is clear is that Wesley believed in some form of religious liberty within theological limits, and he was more than willing to use the legal system to get what he wanted. The third one is the concern for human welfare. I think Wesley had a concern for human welfare, for flourishing, but it was based on the theological concept of the imago Dei, right? That all persons have been made in the image and likeness of God. This is different, by the way, from some contemporary attempts to say that all people are children of God. Wesley would actually reject that designation outright. Only the regenerate, those who have experienced the new birth, are in fact children of God. But all are made in God's image, and that was the basis of Wesley's concern for human welfare. It's a political move based solely on a theological one, and it's a pattern that I think is indicative of Wesley's approach on the whole. But we can see this approach most clearly in his opposition to the slave trade. Here's the basic question. How can one made in the image of God be enslaved? And of course, you can add to this. How can somebody made in the image of God enslave another made in the image of God? Okay, that's the question behind Wesley's thought. So despite the fall, right, the theological concept of the fall, despite the fact that the imago Dei has been marred, and we do not reflect fully God's image anymore, elements of it remain, including the right to basic human dignity. In his famous letter to the evangelical member of Parliament, William Wilberforce, Wesley strongly condemns slavery. But I'm going to show you the part of that letter. But what I want you to note is how theologically it's based and how it begins and ends with God. Okay, here we go. unless the divine power has raised you up, so already with God, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy, which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of human nature. Notice how he ties those things together. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of doing well. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, that vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it. 1791. That's Wesley would die shortly thereafter. Wesley's approach is very similar to the Christian humanism of Renaissance Europe, a movement built on the value of human life made in the image of God. And while the Renaissance humanists are now known for their art and architecture, much of which celebrated the human form and human accomplishment, Wesley's approach is to see the inherent value of humanity and its rightful expression in freedom. Or in his own words, how about this? Give liberty to whom liberty is due, that is to every child of man, to every partaker of human nature. In some ways, this approach can be seen in his love for the poor. In fact, his love for sinners, generally. So, an embodied politic. So with these three Wesleyan ideals that I've tried to outline, a concern for the poor, the protection of religious liberty, and defense of human worth, I think a Wesleyan approach, notice I'm not saying the Wesleyan approach, a Wesleyan approach is possible. But there's a hitch, and it's an important one. And it involves what some have described as death by tennis ball. I'll explain that in a second. In my research, only David Hampton at Harvard has noted this, but it's a vital pivot in Wesley's political outlook, and one that will lead him to what I think is an embodied politic. So even within the Hanoverian camp, right, divisions arose. And the most significant was between King George II and his son and heir, the Prince of Wales, Frederick, who's grinning behind me. The king had embraced the Whigs, right, George II. He was suspect of Tories who had been painted with the tints of Jacobitism. But the Prince of Wales had different political aims and even set up his own court to promote them. However, as some historians argue, a tennis ball, which apparently at this point was much harder than the ones we use now, would actually end the prince's life. In other words, it's thought that he died from injuries sustained while playing this particular game. I think it was hit in the head. And so with his death, the aims of Tories died with him, and those who had placed their hopes in this particular heir to the throne. What happened? Why am I telling you this, other than a curious story about somebody dying playing tennis? It's because Wesley pivots at this point. He pivots from looking at political actions as the means to save the nation, and instead focuses on the revival itself and on the communities of care and the communities of transformed hearts that would be at the center of Methodism. The mission doesn't change. I want you to note this, however, and of course the mission of Methodism is this: to reform the nation, and in particular the church, to spread scriptural holiness across the land. But after the 1750s, we see for Wesley, he didn't expect this to be done by political fiat. Now, we don't have time to go through all the details of the early Methodist system, but it included various groupings, some for accountability, some for care, spiritual and otherwise, others for preaching and hymn singing. The goal of this entire system, which I've described in some of my writing as an economy of grace, all within the Church of England and its sacraments, was transformed hearts, regenerated and sanctified. That's the goal of the Methodist system. And it's within this system that I think that we can find an embodied politic, a Wesleyan political reality taking root. It's within this system that Methodists cared for the poor. And by the way, not because they were outside of the community. The poor were within the community. Wesley wrote this: I visited as many of the sick. How much better it is when it can be done to carry relief to the poor than to send it, and that both for our sake and theirs. And of course, in community, The poor can help each other and help others. This is one of the keys to the Methodist system. It doesn't treat the poor as only objects to be helped. It's within community that health care was primarily addressed amongst early Methodists, even if not exclusively. It was within these communities of new birth where small business loans were extended, widows cared for, orphans raised, and children taught. It wasn't their primary concern. I've already named that. The primary concern was transformed hearts, the spread scriptural holiness. But out of the concern for the restoration of the human heart, the restoration of human community flowed. In other words, the politics of early Methodism in the face of monarchical debates, rebellion, extreme political partisanship, shifting social dynamics, the slave trade, drug addiction, and the lack of health care was to create communities of renewal localized, where actually everyone knew one another's name. And yes, it was fueled by a concern for the poor, for religious liberty and the dignity of each person made in the image of God. But it might best be seen as a politic all its own, focusing first on God and His work, but mirroring to the larger society the way that humans should live with one another. So I would argue it was an embodied politic that actually became a means of grace for each participant. So yes, vote. Do it as an informed Wesleyan, with concern for the poor, for religious liberty, and for human dignity. But even more so, live it as every Wesleyan should. The prayer book states so beautifully in the general thanksgiving, a prayer that Wesley would have known by heart in a book that shaped him and his worldview. This is what it asks. It asks God to give us a due sense of all thy mercies, that our hearts may be unfeigningly thankful, and that we show forth thy praise, not only with our lips, but in our lives, by giving up ourselves to thy service, and by walking before thee in holiness and righteousness all our days. Thank you very much.
Okay, now here's some thoughts and responses from.
Well, first of all, thank you to Ryan for being here and your presentation. Thank you to the Center for Faith and Learning and this event. And I'm very happy to respond to my colleague, Ryan, who's at an institution that I used to serve at myself. And it's a fascinating place to be in Washington, D.C. We were there for 8 years. So the first thing I have to say is I completely agree with you about the Washington, D.C. social gatherings where everyone is identified politically and sometimes by states at the beginning of every evening social gathering. And it's not a bad idea. You kind of know the jokes that you can tell. But really, I do remember the same thing, going to parties and people would say, now, he's a Democrat and he's a Republican, or if they wanted to be more subtle, they could say, well, he works for Representative Whitfield and you have to know Kentucky Republican. And basically you've got the landscape there and the jokes that you can tell and the comments that you can make are sort of guarded by that. I want to emphasize the importance of what Ryan has talked about as John Wesley's context. I think he's one of about 4 historians who has actually accurately recognized the context in which John Wesley was actually living. In the past, we've really had kind of 2 grossly exaggerated views of John Wesley. One was he was a Tory, he was a divine right Tory, he was conservative, and that's interestingly, that was taken up by Victorian Methodists and then, strangely enough, by very liberal, socialist-leaning social historians in the 20th century, like Eli Halevi, who wrote an article on John Wesley and the church in England in his day. And Halevi argued that the Wesleys had saved England from a revolution. And it's interesting because the conservative Methodists latched onto this and said, save England from a revolution, how wonderful. And Eli Halevi thought, how dreadful. He was pro-revolutionary. He was a socialist. He thought the people of England should have risen up against their oppressors and destroyed them. But funny how that argument sort of got off on both sides. But both of them presupposed he was a certain kind of conservative, and that's a divine right monarchist And as Ryan has explained, that idea of divine right wouldn't work after 1689. If you continue to hold that view, if you continue to believe that only the descendants of James II were the rightful monarchs, you were not allowed to serve in government, and you were not allowed to serve in the priesthood of the Church of England. You were basically cut off from public functioning. The other point of view that I think is equally exaggerated concerning John Wesley's political leaning was that idea that he was really a kind of very progressive person. And this, I think, only works with Americans who don't know anything about British politics. They can just read certain passages, some of which you've shared with us, and say, oh yes, look how progressive he was, but not understanding the context in which he worked. Ryan then is part of a trajectory of 4 scholars, Jewish historian Bernard Semmel, interestingly, Theodore Weber, and Jason Vickers, who is our own student from here at SMU, and then Ryan, who have recognized this context of what Ryan has called Wesley's being a moderate or reformed Tory of the early 18th century, and that really makes a big difference in how you interpret his work. I have strong agreement with you, Ryan, on the 3 themes you've noted: concern for the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable, concern for religious liberty, even within an established church, and then third, concern for human welfare, acknowledging the image of God in which all human beings have been created. Now, I raise a question, though, with respect to religious liberty. Was his concern for religious liberty a kind of general thing, or was it actually a justification for his own taking liberties with the church law of the church to which he had committed himself as a priest? That is to say, the church that he was part of and that he had agreed to keep its rules was a church that said you cannot preach in the parish of another priest who has been rightfully established as the pastor of that. Methodists look at this, and John Wesley wants to say, no, I look upon all the world as my parish, and they can invade other ministers' parishes, as if you walked into Highland Park United Methodist Church on Sunday morning and said, sorry, Paul Rasmussen, I'm here to deliver a message from God. That wouldn't be very well received, I can promise you, no matter what point of view you might have been taking up there. I think that's how the Methodists were seen, and sometimes I think John Wesley's arguing for religious liberty was really just saying we need to justify the Methodist violation. We need to say this. Methodists have said this is heroic, following the way of God. We need to say this is illegal because he's violating the rules of the church that he promised to keep when he was ordained. That's my suspicion about that. Now, with concern for the poor and John Wesley's own identity as, you're quoting someone else who's saying he's a country Tory. I think that's right, but it has a really interesting implication. I think that very point of view may have given him an unusual viewpoint from which he could see some of the problems caused by the Industrial Revolution. He's living in the very first decades of the Industrial Revolution, when 2 guys named Thomas had invented more efficient water pumps. Britain is an island. You sink a hole in the ground, it fills up with water. But once you've got an efficient water pump, and this happens in the 1720s and 30s, you can push the water out of the ground and you can go coal mining much more efficiently than you'd ever been able to do in the past. He's living right at that point, and he has this kind of country conservative attitude that industry is really dangerous for poor people. He's seeing people leave their families in the countryside, move to the new industrial cities and suburbs of England, where a few of them are able to get work, most of them don't. And I think it's that very point of view that may lead him to what seems like a rather progressive view in our time. But in his time, I think the industrialists, as you said, were more aligned with the Whigs than with his Tory party, who sort of favored the older agrarian enterprise. Another thing you've said that I think is really important, and that is that it's within a community that health care was primarily addressed by early Methodists. Within this, what you've called an embodied politic. I think that's not only very true, but here I think you're coming perilously close to a rather well-known Dallas theologian named Stanley Hauerwas, who has consistently urged Methodists not only to think about what we want Congress to do for us and the nation, but what we are willing to do within our own context. So to use Stanley's own example, if you're concerned about liberalized abortion laws, yes, you will write to your congresspeople and your senators, and you will try to elect a president maybe who doesn't perhaps share your own religious views, but has promised he's going to push the politics in the direction of that. But Stanley wants to say, you're also going to promise that you will raise children whose parents don't want to raise them. And that's a lot tougher of a promise to make than just writing letters to politicians, right? That's saying, this is what we will do to take responsibility for it. And I think you're right. That's what Methodists were doing. They were saying, this is what we are going to do about the poor, whether the Parliament or anyone else is willing to do something about it. They wouldn't stop that. So an embodied politic, very, very true. Finally, I would say maybe just a little more about how very active John Wesley was involved in politics. I'm the editor of his letters. I recently, in the last few years, published an edition of letters between 1756 and 1765. Month after month, week after week, he's writing to politicians, he's writing to people about politics. In that first volume that I did, the year was 1756, two examples in the month of March 1756. One is a letter to the Honorable James West, who was Member of Parliament, offering to raise a company of volunteers for His Majesty's service in the upcoming war that British people call the 7 Years' War. You may have heard of it as the French and Indian War in U.S. history. If anybody ever argues that John Wesley was a pacifist, and I've heard Stan Hauerwas come close to that, and there's a couple of people who want to do that. Utterly not true. I mean, here he's raising a company of Methodist soldiers so that they can serve the crown against France in that particular war. In the same month, really just 3 days later, there is a letter to his friend Ebenezer Blackwell indicating his support, interestingly, for a Whig candidate, John Spencer, over the Tory candidate, Gerrit Smith, in a Bristol by-election at that time. Now, normally, as you say, John Wesley is going to side with the Tories, but in this case, he's afraid that this Tory is a very dangerous Jacobite, that is to say, someone who's leaning towards the restoration of the Stuart monarchy and might be leaning towards Catholicism. And so John Wesley has a kind of nuanced political view. I would say it would be like Democrats in the 1990s who thought that Bill Clinton should have resigned after he admitted that he lied about Monica Lewinsky, not just because they wanted to ruin Bill Clinton, and some of them did, but they thought that the Democrats would do better in the election of 2000 if, in fact, Al Gore had come in as an incumbent rather than coming in sort of green and so forth. So there's just lots of this in John Wesley's letters. He is constantly engaged with politics, and anyone who knew him would have known that. So thank you, Ryan. You've given a nuanced picture of this subject, and I'm deeply grateful. And we will, by the way, I brought a copy of his book. Just to show you, I'm in Vanna White here. This is Ryan's new book. And it's cool because it starts out with an essay by, of all people, a guy named Michael McCurry, who was Bill Clinton's press secretary during the Monica Lewinsky period. And he's writing on Wesleyan political theology, a practitioner's view, which I think is a very interesting take on that. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, well, we have some time for questions. Yeah, you may want to go to the front. And call on people. But yeah, so any questions that you have for the speakers? Yes, sir.
Did John Wesley know Selena Hastings, or is that a Whitfield piece? In other words, she was pretty politically active, and also carried on quite a correspondence with George Washington.
Oh, yeah, no, they definitely knew each other. They were connected throughout most of the revival. Their great split was after 1770, although she was closer to Charles Wesley than John. I think Charles Wesley liked being around a member of the gentry class. And you see in the letters, he's always saying, "My lady." Yeah, so there's definitely a connection there. And I think when you're looking at Hastings or Huntington, they both died in 1791. She and John Wesley both died in 1791. I think with their death, it kind of brings it's the end of the first generation of the revival with the death of Huntington, Hastings, and Wesley. But yeah, they were definitely connected and definitely knew each other. In fact, for a while, wasn't John Wesley? No, he wasn't her chaplain. George Whitefield was her chaplain.
Yeah.
He was a chaplain to somebody else.
Can I say something about that?
Absolutely.
About Selina Shirley Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon.
Right.
One of the letters that I had to include as an incoming letter to John Wesley in 1756-57, sometime in that period, was a letter from John Newton. Now, you know John Newton was the author of Amazing Grace, a poetry writer, and closely associated with him. Well, he's writing on behalf of the Countess of Huntingdon, and he's saying, "We've heard that there's this Greek Orthodox bishop who is ordaining people as presbyters, as deacons, priests, and bishops." He was wrong about bishops, actually.
Right.
But we think that we could use his services to, quote, "establish a new ministry," close quote. And that would mean they were actually kind of plotting to establish a new succession of ministry and bishops in England, in contrast to that of the Church of England. So pretty wild. But yeah, they were connected.
That's cool.
Good question. Yes. I know we're kind of carefully trying to make connections to the past or present, and let me offer this possibility. Like, in our age, we hear a lot of discussion about disruption in politics. In what sense do you think that Wesley contributes to disruption of politics in these times, or is he an agent that is kind of keeping things stable, or how do the two of you see that for and against in terms of disruption in politics?
I mean, I think there are different levels to that question, right? Ted, you were talking about about religious liberty aspect.
Yes.
Was Wesley trying to justify what he was doing, or did he believe in religious liberty? And I think that touches on your question. I'm going to be bad, and I'll say it's both. Good politician, right?
Yeah.
No, Wesley, you can see it over and over again. He does twist the rules to justify doing all kinds of things. But he does it in a way that you think he's either oblivious to the rules or he's a genius.
How would he be a genius?
Well, because he was able to maneuver through
I see.
the legal limbo that existed only in that time,
Yeah.
given the state of the Church of England. It wasn't decrepit, it's just that they really weren't enforcing a lot of the rules at that point. And he kind of found this sweet spot in any other time in history in England, Wesley would not have gotten away with creating this seemingly dangerous subculture of secret meetings. But he did, and I think he did it by being both subversive and conservative at the same time. That would be my approach. Ted, did you want to add? Is that fair?
So you both mentioned Wesley as a advocate for the poor. Would you say that his priority was more for government programs to take control of that, or was that religious ideas, or was that more nonprofit work?
Yeah.
Well, it was primarily nonprofit. I would say there was a social net at this point. It wasn't very strong. It was very weak, but the nation did it as a Christian nation. But no, they would have never seen the role of government to be to have kind of social programming. I think that we would assume.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, one of the great tragedies of the Protestant Reformation, this is something that we Protestants didn't learn in Sunday school, but it was that in doing away with religious orders like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and so forth, Northern Europe did away with social services, right? I mean, because the religious orders had been providing the hospitals, the hospices, medical care, care for the poor, and so forth, and they're left without significant services, and then they have to kind of begin building it back up. But as Ryan has said, it's very, very weak at this point. And I think what the Methodists are doing is not trying to say, here's what the government should do. It's saying, here's what we within our own societies are going to do. So, for example, they're going to encourage members of their societies to build their own businesses and to support them, and they're kind of building an alternative economy. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I do want to add something about the monasteries.
Yeah.
You visit these ruins now, and of course it all gets me all riled up to visit those ruins and think of the beautiful things that they tore down. At the same time, some social historians argue that had Britain not dismantled the control the monasteries had over land in England, and distributed that land amongst all kinds of people, Henry VIII used it to pay off people and get their favors, that a middle class might not have arisen in England because of the control that the monasteries had on land. So it's interesting, just to throw that out.
You're a lot more liberal than I am on that.
It's the first time you've ever called me liberal.
It was fun.
Would you comment on Wesley? So let me back up. Sorry. I think we operate in our country with sort of just a baseline nervousness about religious people engaging in political talk because of the separation of church and state.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kind of a principle that keeps us bounded a certain way. And of course, since we have an established church in England, people didn't feel that way necessarily, and Wesley certainly didn't, because during the American Rebellion, he's writing a number of letters to politically powerful people and expressing his conviction. Can you comment, both of you, about the sort of, if we're going to try to make use of Wesley in some way, how do we make that shift and kind of recognize the difference between the way we think about these things generally and the way he would have thought of it? So he's very politically engaged, but on different terms than we think are appropriate.
Go ahead. I love him going first.
You can say that.
Well, all right, so I think this is an interesting debate. I'm going to shift it just a little bit. This is an interesting debate that often takes place between Methodists and Lutherans.
Yeah.
Because of Luther's idea of like a two-kingdom, kind of separate ideals there. I don't think a Wesleyan Christian is capable of compartmentalizing their life and their beliefs that way. So that your politics has to flow out of your experience of a transforming event with God that we call the new birth. And if it doesn't, then the question is it Wesleyan at all, even at a very basic level? So how could a Methodist or a Wesleyan or whatever not be that same person in the public square that they are supposed to be in their society meeting? I think that'd be the first thing that I would point out. My opinion as somebody in the Wesleyan movement is that I think we need to be even louder in the public square because of the separation of church and state. And of course, understanding what that meant in the 18th century context is important too. I mean, we do debate this in Washington quite a bit. The founders were saying we don't want an established church. They weren't saying that religion doesn't have a role in public life. And I think that's something that Christians in general, whether Wesleyans or not, should be talking about. But given the fact that the government is not going to have a role, like there are no bishops in the Senate, that might be a good thing. No bishops in the Senate means that I think the onus is on us even more to speak into the public square and not actually hide the worldview that we say is reality. Now I'm really sounding like Stanley Hauerwas.
You're in Dallas.
I'm in Dallas, yeah. Did you want to?
No, that's good.
Okay.
I'm with.
Yes, sir.
How does a Wesleyan practice his, we understand the whole charity part in the face of practicing politics, how do you integrate your holiness in the face of all these restriction on public prayers and shouting out Jesus and talking about those kind of things? Anything that has to do with God is not really encouraged in the public square nowadays. So, as a Wesleyan, if you ask me to bring the two together as John Wesley did, how do I practice that aspect of my holiness?
Can I make a start on that?
Yeah.
And the way I'd start to respond to that is to say, we've had a kind of evolution, and Methodists are not different than other churches in how you respond to this. I think Stanley Hauerwas is right, and you're quite right to say initially Methodists were trying to do not what the government could do, but what we could do in our own societies. But that had implications. They wanted the government, for example, to let them free to do that. That's your religious liberty component there. Now, that meant early on, Methodist people had very direct contact with the poor. You weren't just thinking philosophically or theologically or hypothetically about the poor. You were to meet poor people eyeball to eyeball. And one thing about John Wesley is proximity. He's constantly with the poor, and you know he understands them. And this is why he can make the statement that those who think the poor are poor because they're idle, because they're lazy. You still hear that all the time. He says they simply don't understand. They've never been with the poor, and he castigates that point of view. Now, one of our developments as Methodists in the United States, this is where my sort of later Methodist history stuff comes up, is we got more and more respectable. Methodists did. This is one of the things John Wesley interestingly warned about. But through the Victorian period, the 19th century, we became more and more politically powerful as Methodists got. I think by the early 20th century, at points, Methodists were almost a majority in the United States Congress. And it was very, Methodists were very proud of this. But at the same time, we became disengaged from direct contact. And we could think that by just getting the right people elected, we could bring about the kingdom of God. And so Methodists, instead of engaging with the poor, just vote for this candidate, vote for that candidate, and become sort of abstracted from it. That, I think, was a deep mistake. And I think part of what we're doing now is trying to reconnect ourselves in ways that we have that sort of direct contact. But the main thing, I think, is that you can never substitute just political action for being directly engaged with people. A couple of years ago, Ryan, we had Brian Stevenson here on our campus, and he's the guy who's written the book about just mercy. This is about prison reform and so forth. He's an AME, Methodist, and so he talks about this, but he says it's all about proximity. Once you get to know people eyeball to eyeball, and I think that's what we've lost. That's the way I'd respond.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, you know, Mike McCurry is a colleague of mine, and we actually do talks together in Washington to kind of give we disagree on a lot, let's put it that way. And we have fun with it. But it's interesting because we don't disagree on whether or not we should help the poor, we disagree on how to do it.
Right.
And that's when the conversation actually gets really interesting, because we're both being forced as Wesleyans to say, yes, we need to be actively engaged in the public square, helping the poor, but how? And then the debate kind of gets, much more nuanced. So I think, anyway, that's just to piggyback on what you were saying.
Well, could I build on this, circling back to what I think was a key element of your question, which is, to what extent did Wesley feel like the Christian part, the Jesus part, had to be foregrounded in this, right? That it's all well and good to help the poor, but did Wesley feel like that needed to be overtly in the name of Jesus and leading with a kind of public Christianity.
Okay.
Does that touch on you?
Sure hope you can answer.
Well, I mean, that's the way Wesley was. Just, he was that way when he was asleep. There are times when he talks about, meeting basic necessities, but the majority of the time he's saying your primary job is to save people. You have nothing to do but to save souls. So, and everything else has to stem from it. Scriptural holiness was a changed heart, and yes, it actually engaged you in the work of God in the world, but yeah, you had to have that changed heart first. So the idea of, especially a Wesleyan group engaging in politics or engaging in any kind of social work without the gospel, I think is antithetical to the Wesleyan tradition itself. Did you want to add?
Yeah, well, and I would say that can go both in liberal and conservative political ways. So, for example, 1928, the U.S. presidential election was between Alfred Emanuel Smith and Herbert Hoover, right? So Methodists are absolutely bolted up about that. They are excited about this because they can't support Alfred Emanuel Smith. He is a wet Catholic, son of an immigrant, good grief. All this kind of prejudice kind of comes into it. And Herbert Hoover is a dry Protestant. Now, this created an enormous problem for Methodists in the South, because how could you possibly vote for a Republican? I mean, some of you are so young you don't remember this, but there was a time when Southern politics was just Democratic politics, and if you didn't vote in the Democratic primary, you were just throwing away your vote. So Southern Methodists had a real problem with this, but that's at the point at which they begin to come around. And to make it close to home here, I really think that's probably when Dr. Josie Tower, who was a Methodist in my conference in the East Texas area, began to secretly be Republican. You were never supposed to announce as clergy that you were this party or that party. In the South, you were just Democrat unless proven guilty or something like that. But his son was John Tower, and he was one of the very first Republicans elected to the Senate from the South in a long time, since Reconstruction, I guess. And I think it's not surprising that that kind of politics played into Methodist life.
Do we have other questions? Yes, sir.
How effective would you say these ideas were in terms of actually leading to transformation in the communities in England, in the American colonies, in terms of where the Methodists were in the largest concentration? When you talk about caring for the poor, caring for the sick, this kind of thing, how is there measurable impact that's been identified from that?
That'd be really interesting. The two areas with the strongest Methodist constituencies would have been Yorkshire and Cornwall in the 18th century, at least in England. You have to remember, John Wesley kicked out thousands of people out of his societies. He would visit a society and he'd kick out 175 people. I love the lists, though, about why they were kicked out. Some for drinking, some for abuse, some for, like one or two for all these things, and then there'd be 185. General laziness.
Drinking spirituous liquors.
Spirituous liquors, right.
That means not beer or wine.
Right. So the question, I don't know about studies in those particular areas. That would be where you'd look. The southeast of England, so Oxbridge, London, Canterbury, where the majority of the people lived and still do, was referred to as a Methodist desert well into the 19th century.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, I don't know, maybe there's a PhD project for somebody who wants to do
But
that.
I can follow that in the United States. The Methodist trajectory was basically start at Baltimore, cross the mountains on the route of the C&O Canal, get to the headwaters of the Ohio River and then follow the Ohio River down both sides, Kentucky and Ohio and so forth, to the Mississippi. And that area is still the area of the United States that still has the highest Methodists per capita. So it's kind of halfway between the South and the North. It's kind of
Delaware.
Delaware. Yeah, well, it starts at the Delmarva Peninsula and then goes to Baltimore. So
Right.
yeah, but I don't know statistical studies. I don't know about that. I really don't.
Yeah. You got us, Phil.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more quick questions. Arlene, go ahead.
Oh, this may be not good, but it's pressing on me. I wondered if John Wesley,
Mhm.
standing here today, what words of advice, what do you think in this? I mean, I'm older and I've been around. I'm Southern Baptist. I don't know all this history, so this has been just fascinating.
Good.
I know I should maybe read more things, but oh wow! I just it's one of the most divided times in our country. Same question. Good.
Yeah.
What would he say to us in our?
What would he say to us? These wonderful students that are here, these young whippersnappers who faith in them to help us figure this out.
Right. I mean, okay, I might go with he talked about love incessantly. If you look at Charles Wesley's hymns, you can identify the hymn by how many times he uses the word love without even looking at the bottom of the page. When he describes perfection, it's the holy love of God reigning in your heart, so that sin no longer reigns. I think that's what he would talk to us about. And it is a time of division. It's a time of division for Methodists. And what I've been telling everybody that will listen to me at all is, before we even talk about division, just love one another. Just at a very basic level. That's, there's the book, there you go. There you go. That book came out of a conference that I put together in Washington with speakers from various seminaries, and we didn't all agree. I mean, you get 10 academics in a room, you have 15 opinions at least. Just like Methodists. But the fact is, we loved one another for 3 days, enough to listen, enough to be patient, enough not to do any name calling. I mean, there were stark differences in political and theological perspective between people in this group. And the harmony of that group was really quite astounding, especially for a conference about politics in Washington, D.C. So that's what I would talk about. But I think it has to. One of the things I've noticed, and you can even see this in Washington, oftentimes people don't have friends who disagree with them.
Oh, okay.
They don't. I mean,
okay. That's a problem.
The people that you have over for dinner, the people who are on your Christmas card list that you actually talk to. I'm not talking about Facebook friends, although we seem to be friends, or we seem to be getting rid of people we don't agree with on our Facebook lists, or Twitter, or whatever, or Instagram. I should sound as old as I am. We need to stop that. We need to stop weeding out people we disagree with and invite them over for dinner. So I think that's something that's but it's not just be nice, because that's be nice, that I think has to come out of the fact that we've experienced the love of God, and we need to actually treat others with the same love that we've encountered and that God has for them. I think that needs to be the basis. I mean, I'll tell you, Deb and I get together at least once or twice a year. We don't agree on everything. We're being really nice to each other. But there's a deep friendship that's lasted for years and years. And it's something I'm thankful for. So I'll say that public kudos to you.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I, of course, have to agree with that. Now, I would say there's 2 angles on your question, though. And one is, there's a couple of things you could say John Wesley would say if he was here. He'd say, repent and believe the gospel. He'd say, seek the holiness without which no one will see the Lord, those kinds of things. But if you want to ask how he would come out on contemporary issues that we think about very differently than people in the 18th century thought about it, the question would be, do you just rip him out of the 18th century and drop him down in SMU? Or does somebody get to give him the tutorial on what's happened since then and the science and bring him up to date? And the answer would depend upon who gives the tutorial. So actually, historically, we have to say, you can't do that. If John Wesley were here today, I think this is absolutely true, he would not be John Wesley. See, he's not. You just can't do that in that respect.
All right, great. So, last question, Jackson, I'll give you the final word.
Oh, shoot, I don't know if I'll be the last one. Okay. I was talking with him, and I thought, why do they need to specify exploring theology or Wesleyan political theology, not just do it from a Methodist perspective, but sitting here, it kind of made sense because I think you can have a Methodist who, I guess, there's not really an institutional kind of way that the church maybe approaches a lot of issues. You can have very different, I guess, kind of theological backings for certain political ideas based off of where you come from in the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, do you feel that the church has kind of gotten away from a Wesleyan political theology, or why is there a need to specify that, not just say this is the Methodist political?
Yeah, I mean, the term Wesleyan encompasses a tradition that is larger than the term Methodist. And much larger than the term United Methodist. I'm assuming that's what you meant by the church?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have Wesleyan brothers and sisters in the Church of Nazarene, and the Free Methodists, and the Wesleyans, and the AME, and the Salvation Army. There's a whole group of denominations that would fall under the banner Wesleyan, and they trace their heritage back to him in the same way that those of us in the United Methodist Church would do. So that's one of the reasons I use that. The other reason given turmoil in United Methodism, the term Wesleyan helps us kind of step away from it.
Yes.
And look more at the origins of the movement. Who knows what's going to happen at General Conference in May? The term United Methodist might be completely gone. If not in practice, then in reality. So that would be another reason I would stay away from it. But I think a pan-Methodist or Wesleyan approach is useful to understand the whole movement. Yeah, think of the World Methodist Council. There are about 70 million Methodists in the world now, and 60 or 70 million. Out of those, 11 million United Methodists?
12 or 13 globally.
12 or 13?
13 million.
So that gives you an idea numerically why we would also do that. Yeah. And I think mainly with my work, the TES work, we focus on early Methodism most of the time anyway, well before the United Methodist Church existed. So, does that help?
Oh, very good.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me thank, first of all, our speakers. Thank you so much, Professor Danker, Professor Campbell. I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Center for Faith and Learning. I want to just very quickly acknowledge a few people who are here. First of all, our chaplain to the university, Steve Rankin, who is an important partner in all that we do in the Center for Faith and Learning. Secondly, Phil Carlson, who has done tremendous work in the Center for Faith and Learning. Third, I'd like to acknowledge Annette Vaughn, who sits on the board of the Center for Faith and Learning. Thank you for all of your support. Thank you for being here. And finally, I'd like to thank Arlene Manthe, who asked a very good question and who also helps us tremendously in doing development work and building and fundraising for the Center for Faith and Learning, because we as a center are entirely supported by contributions from people who want to see this kind of work being done at SMU, who want to promote the integration of intellectual and spiritual life on this campus. And so thank you, Arlene, for your help in bringing those people to us and in helping us to build what we've done here.